Most people believe that if something matters, you try harder. They believe effort is proof of depth. That persistence means commitment. That stopping is what happens when you lose interest, courage, or love. And for a long time, this belief feels unquestionable. It's reinforced everywhere. In relationships, in work, in the way we praise those who endure without complaint. You learn early that being steady makes you valuable, that staying available keeps things intact, that explaining yourself prevents misunderstandings before they turn into distance. So you lean in. You stay present when it would be easier to pull back. You clarify when silence might be more honest. You absorb tension so others don't have to carry it. And none of this feels like sacrifice at first. It feels like maturity. It feels like being someone who understands. For a long time, it even works. Then something begins to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically. There is no argument, no rupture, no moment you can point to and say, this is where it ended. Instead, there is a weight that slowly appears. You notice that trying no longer brings clarity. That effort doesn't resolve anything. It only prolongs it. That the more you adjust, the less present you feel inside yourself. This is confusing because nothing on the surface is broken. Conversations still happen. Responsibilities are still met. People still rely on you. From the outside, everything looks stable. But inside, something feels misaligned. You find yourself pausing before responding, not to choose better words, but because the impulse to explain doesn't arrive the way it used to. You read messages that once would have pulled you forward, and instead of urgency, there is a quiet stillness. Not resistance, not irritation, just nothing pushing you anymore. At first, you tell yourself you're tired, that you need rest, that it's temporary. But rest doesn't restore the old drive, because what's missing isn't energy. It's belief. Belief that continuing to try will actually change something. And that realization is deeply disorienting. You were never someone who quit easily. You were never careless with connection. You didn't avoid effort. You embodied it. So when the effort fades without explanation, it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like standing in unfamiliar territory without a map. Part of you wonders if this is detachment, if you're becoming colder, if something essential has gone missing. But there is no bitterness here, no desire to withdraw in protest. What's gone is simpler and stranger, the reflex to insist, the automatic leaning forward, the internal pressure to fix, smooth, or hold things together. You still care, but care no longer demands movement. And that contradiction is hard to name, because the world taught you that care is action, that presence requires effort, that stopping means you stopped valuing something. Yet here you are, valuing yourself enough to notice that continuing feels heavier than stopping. Not heavier emotionally, heavier physically, in your chest, in your shoulders, in the way your body no longer wants to stay slightly ahead of everyone else. Nothing dramatic has happened. You haven't made a declaration. You haven't drawn a boundary. You haven't decided anything. You simply reached a point where trying feels dishonest. And that moment, the one that looks like giving up from the outside, doesn't arrive with collapse. It arrives with silence. A silence where effort used to live. And in that silence, something subtle begins to surface. Not an answer. Not a solution. Just the first quiet indication that whatever is happening here is not failure, even if it doesn't look like success. There is a kind of exhaustion that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't arrive as collapse. It doesn't come with anger or despair. It settles quietly, after years of doing something that once felt natural. For a long time, you didn't notice it because empathy was never a burden to you. It was instinct. You sensed shifts in tone before words were spoken. You felt tension before it surfaced. You noticed when something was off, even when everyone else said things were fine. At first, this felt like a gift. You could adjust before conflict appeared. You could soften moments before they hardened. You could stay connected when others pulled away. And because it worked, you kept doing it. Over time, you became the one who held emotional space, the one who understood without being asked, the one who adapted first. Not because you were told to, but because you could. Slowly, this ability became a role. You were the one people leaned on, the one who absorbed moods without comment, the one who stayed present even when your own internal signals suggested pulling back. There were moments when the exhaustion arrived before anything even happened, before the conversation, before the meeting, before the message was sent. You would notice it in the preparation, the subtle mental rehearsal that started automatically, the quiet scanning for emotional tone, the inner adjustment that happened before a single word was exchanged. Nothing had gone wrong yet, and already, your system was organizing itself around potential outcomes. You learned to do this so early that it stopped feeling like effort. It felt like awareness. But awareness, when constant, has weight. You felt it when simple interactions began to feel layered. When you entered rooms already calculating how to remain stable inside them. When your presence came with an unspoken readiness to regulate what might unfold. Not because someone asked you to, but because you knew you could. Over time, this anticipation became routine. You weren't responding anymore. You were pre-responding. You didn't wait for emotional demand to appear. You carried it in advance. And this is the part few people ever see. The exhaustion didn't come from what was said. It came from everything that happened before saying anything at all. You could feel it when your body tensed slightly at the sound of a notification, when your attention shifted outward before you consciously chose it, when being available meant being mentally ahead of the present moment. None of this looked dramatic. It looked functional. But inside, it meant you were rarely fully here. Your inner life became a background process, always running, rarely centered, and eventually, even without a breaking point, that constant readiness began to feel unsustainable, not emotionally overwhelming, structurally misaligned, and none of this felt dramatic. From the outside, you appeared calm, reliable, emotionally mature. Inside, however, something subtle was happening. Your attention was rarely with you. It was scanning, tracking, adjusting. You learned to read the emotional temperature of a room before entering it, to choose your words carefully so others wouldn't feel unsettled, to explain yourself preemptively, just in case misunderstanding might arise. This wasn't people-pleasing in the obvious sense. It was perceptiveness turned inward. But perceptiveness, when unbounded, becomes obligation. You didn't just feel your own emotions. You carried everyone else's reactions to them. And slowly, without noticing the moment it happened, your inner life began to organize itself around external stability. You became good at holding things together. So good, in fact, that no one ever questioned the cost. You still showed up. You still listened. You still cared. But something inside you stopped feeling included in the process. You noticed it when you began to feel tired before interactions even started. When a simple conversation felt like preparation. When explaining yourself felt repetitive, as if you'd already lived the outcome before it happened. Not frustration. Not resentment. Just fatigue. A quiet sense that you were always a step ahead, and never fully present. What makes this exhaustion difficult to recognize is that nothing looks wrong. There is no obvious harm, no clear boundary crossed, no single moment that demands change. You are not in crisis, and yet something feels unsustainable. You begin to notice how often you set aside your own reactions, how frequently you delay your needs, how easily you override discomfort in the name of understanding. Not because someone demanded it, but because you learned that this was how connection stayed intact. Eventually, Empathy stops feeling like openness and starts feeling like responsibility. Responsibility to manage, to stabilize, to prevent. And that responsibility grows heavier with time, until one day you realize that the tiredness you feel is not about people themselves. It's about the role you've been playing inside relationships, a role that required constant awareness, constant adjustment, constant presence. And the moment this realization surfaces, quietly and without drama, something important becomes clear. You are not exhausted because you care too much. You are exhausted because caring was never allowed to have a center. At some point, the effort stops responding, not because you decide to stop trying, but because the mechanism that once carried you forward no longer activates. There is no clear signal, no internal command that says enough. You simply notice that the familiar pull isn't there. You receive a message that once would have required immediate attention, and instead of urgency, there is a pause. Not avoidance, not resistance, just a moment where nothing inside you moves to meet it. This is unsettling, because for so long, movement was automatic. You were used to leaning in before you even thought about it, to adjusting your tone mid-sentence, to clarifying yourself before confusion could arise. That reflex was so ingrained that it felt like part of your personality. So when it disappears quietly, it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like something important failed to show up. You start noticing it in small ways. You don't rush to respond anymore. You don't fill emotional gaps instinctively. You don't anticipate reactions the way you used to. You still care, but care no longer translates into immediate action. And because nothing dramatic happened to justify this shift, you begin to question yourself. Am I withdrawing? Am I becoming indifferent? Did something in me harden? Others may notice it too. They might say you're quieter, that you're less available, that you seem distant. And part of you wonders if they are right. Because from the outside, the change is subtle but real. What they don't see is that this isn't distance from them. It's distance from a role. For a long time, you carried the unspoken task of keeping things balanced, of smoothing emotional edges, of holding the invisible threads that kept interactions comfortable. You didn't choose this task consciously. It grew out of awareness, sensitivity, and responsibility. But every role that begins unconsciously eventually asks a price, and the price is paid in energy. The moment this role begins to collapse, it doesn't do so with conflict. It collapses through absence. The absence of urgency, the absence of explanation, the absence of the familiar inner pressure to maintain equilibrium. This absence is often misread, by others, as coldness, by you, as failure. What makes this phase difficult to describe is that it unfolds in ordinary time. Days pass, weeks move forward. Nothing changes outwardly enough to justify the shift. You still show up. You still function. You still engage when necessary. But internally, there is a growing neutrality that doesn't have a name yet. You are not relieved. You are not distressed. You are simply no longer propelled. This in-between space can feel unsettling, because it doesn't offer language or direction. You don't know if you are moving toward something, or away from something, and without a story to explain it, the mind looks for familiar categories. Am I withdrawing? Am I avoiding? Am I becoming indifferent? But none of these quite fit, because what has disappeared is not interest. It is compulsion, and without compulsion, time feels different, slower, less urgent. That change alone can feel disorienting, when urgency was once the organizing force of your inner life. But something very precise is happening here. Your system is no longer willing to perform an action that disconnects you from yourself, not because you decided to stop caring, but because continuing would require further self-erasure. So the psyche intervenes in the only way it can, without creating drama. It withdraws energy. The result is not collapse in the usual sense. Life doesn't fall apart. Relationships don't necessarily end. Everything continues to exist. But the way you participate has shifted. You no longer overextend to keep things intact. You no longer compensate for what isn't yours to carry. You no longer explain yourself into alignment. And in that space, uncomfortable at first, something begins to settle. The tension that lived in your body softens. Your shoulders drop without effort. Your attention stops scanning ahead of the present moment. This is not numbness. Numbness blocks sensation. What you're experiencing now is different. It's a reduction of noise, a quieting of the internal demand to act. And once that demand fades, you can finally see what it was costing you. Not connection, but orientation. For years, your focus was directed outward, constantly adjusting to maintain harmony. Now, without effort, it begins to return. Not dramatically, not triumphantly, just steadily. And in that steady return, the exhaustion you once feared begins to make sense. It wasn't a warning that something was wrong with you. It was a signal that something no longer fit. Carl Jung noticed something that often goes unrecognized in everyday life. The psyche does not negotiate with us through ideas. It doesn't persuade. It doesn't explain. It regulates through energy. When a pattern supports growth, it is energized. When it no longer does, vitality is quietly withdrawn. This is why psychological change rarely arrives as insight first. It arrives as fatigue. For a long time, empathy can function as an adaptation. It keeps relationships intact. It minimizes conflict. It creates a sense of belonging in environments where direct expression might feel unsafe. In this sense, empathy is not weakness. It is intelligence applied relationally. But Jung observed that every adaptation has a lifespan. When adaptation becomes identity, when responsiveness replaces orientation, the unconscious intervenes, not by creating a crisis, but by reducing the energy available to maintain the pattern. This is where exhaustion enters, not as punishment, not as collapse, but as regulation. The psyche is not saying stop caring. It is saying this configuration is no longer viable. Jung referred to a state he called participation mystique, a condition in which the boundaries between the inner world and the outer world are blurred. In this state, the individual's emotional center is not fully differentiated. Reactions, expectations, and needs flow freely across psychological borders. For someone sensitive and perceptive, this state can persist for years. You don't just feel your own emotions. You feel the atmosphere around you. You don't just respond. You anticipate. At first, this feels like connection. But over time, it becomes entanglement. And entanglement requires constant energy. What the psyche eventually does is subtle. It begins to dissolve the fusion. Not through confrontation, not through force, but through withdrawal. The moment you noticed the reflex to explain fading, that was not indifference. It was differentiation beginning. The pause before responding, the lack of urgency, the neutral space where reaction used to be. These are not signs of emotional loss. They are signs of separation. Separation does not mean distance from others. It means distinction between what belongs to you and what does not. This is why the transition feels strange. You are not becoming someone new. You are becoming less merged. Jung understood individuation not as improvement, but as alignment, a process in which the psyche reorganizes itself around a clearer internal axis. When this reorganization begins, the old strategies stop working. Not because they were wrong, but because they were temporary. Empathy that once served survival now obstructs orientation. So the unconscious does what consciousness cannot do gently. It removes the fuel. This explains why no decision was required, why there was no dramatic boundary setting, why the change felt passive rather than assertive. The psyche does not argue with roles that outlived their usefulness. It starves them, and when the role loses energy, behavior follows. This also explains the emotional neutrality that often accompanies this stage. People expect relief, or sadness, or clarity. Instead, there is quiet. This quiet is not emptiness. It is the absence of constant relational adjustment. For the first time in a long time, your inner state is not being shaped in response to something external. And that is unsettling, because orientation feels unfamiliar when it has been outsourced for years. But this unfamiliarity is temporary. Jung believed that when the psyche withdraws energy from a pattern, it does so to make room for a more truthful configuration. Not louder, not stronger, more accurate. The exhaustion you experienced was not the problem. It was the mechanism through which separation became possible. And once separation begins, clarity no longer needs to be forced. It emerges on its own. After this shift, nothing announces itself. There is no moment where you suddenly feel better. No surge of clarity. No sense of victory. Life continues almost exactly as it was before. You wake up. You move through the same spaces. You speak to the same people. But something fundamental has changed beneath the surface. You notice it first in your body. You no longer lean forward automatically. Your shoulders rest where they are. Your breath settles without instruction. There is less internal commentary running ahead of the moment. Not because you learned a technique, but because the pressure that required constant adjustment is gone. You still listen. You still perceive subtle shifts. You still care. But care no longer pulls you out of yourself. It moves through you, not ahead of you. This is where many people expect transformation to feel dramatic. They imagine confidence returning, energy surging, a renewed sense of purpose. Instead, what arrives is quieter. Proportion. You respond when something genuinely moves you. You pause when it doesn't. You no longer fill emotional space out of habit. Silence stops feeling like something that needs to be managed. It becomes neutral. And neutrality, for someone who lived in constant attunement, can feel unfamiliar at first, almost empty. But this emptiness is not loss. It is space reclaimed. You notice how much effort used to go into staying available, how much internal movement was required to maintain harmony, how often your attention was directed outward before you even realized it had left. Now, attention returns without force. Not dramatically, not defiantly, just naturally. You begin to sense your own limits again, not as boundaries you must defend, but as contours that quietly exist. You don't need to explain them. They are felt. This is not withdrawal from life. It is a recalibration of participation. You still engage, but you no longer disappear inside engagement. The empathic sensitivity remains, but it no longer leads the system. It informs, then releases. And this changes the quality of your presence. You are less reactive, less anticipatory, less compelled to resolve what was never yours to resolve. People may experience you differently now. Some will feel the absence of the old availability. Others will feel a steadier presence. You may not explain the difference, because explanation would return you to the old pattern, and you don't need to justify what feels aligned. This is not a comeback that restores who you were before. That version of you existed to survive a particular configuration. What emerges now is quieter, but more accurate. You are no longer organized around maintaining emotional balance externally. You are oriented internally, and that orientation does not need reinforcement. It holds on its own. There is no final insight here, no conclusion to draw, only a shift in how effort relates to care. Effort is no longer the proof of depth. Presence no longer requires strain. Connection no longer demands self-erasure. What remains is not distance from others, but closeness to yourself. A closeness that does not need to be named. a silence that does not need to be filled. And in that silence, something has already begun, without force, without insistence, without needing to be understood.